Broadcasting from Silicon Valley, California, this is Conversations with Jennylyn.
You're watching Conversations with Jennylyn, and today my guest is not a stranger to my show. He is Canadian Superior Court Judge, Dr. Irving Andre, and I'm thrilled that he was able to carve time out of his very busy schedule to spend with us. However, today we're not discussing his career or anything that we may have talked about in the past, but he has written a book, a special book, and he will tell us about it. Welcome to Conversations with Jennylyn once more, Dr. Andre.
Thank you very much, Jennylyn, and let me thank you for inviting me to your wonderful program. It is indeed a pleasure, and I really appreciate it. Let me also say good evening to your listeners. I hope everyone is keeping safe. I hope everyone is being safe. And I hope everyone, hopefully sooner or later, if not already, will receive his or her vaccine. These are difficult times, but again, with some perseverance, some dedication, and some precautions, hopefully we'll be able to ride this through. Yes, I have written a book. It's two books. The main one is called, it's a political biography. It's called Rosie Douglas, Fearless Fighter for Freedom. Who was Rosie Douglas? Many persons may know of that name. Rosie Douglas was Dominica's Prime Minister from January 2000 to October 2000. He passed away somewhat suddenly, much to the anguish of thousands of persons, tens of thousands of persons worldwide. And the loss was a particularly difficult one for not only for his family, for Dominicans and West Indians and Africans in diaspora, because Rosie played a significant role in the upliftment of persons of African origin and other persons, other racialized individuals throughout the world. So I took the time off to write a biography of him. Why? Because it just so happened that I grew up in Portsmouth, Dominica's second town, where Rosie was from. In fact, I went to school with some of his younger siblings. And in the mid to late 70s, while I was a student, I was part of an organization which was formed by Rosie as Dominica grouped tentatively towards political independence. Rosie gained some notoriety in 1969, February, when he was involved in an incident known worldwide as the Sir George Williams University riot. It was unfortunately a sit-in which degenerated into a degree of violence where students largely of Caribbean origin, but also of African, Canadian, they basically took a stand against the actions of one of the professors of the university, who unfortunately was accused of lowballing students, West Indian students particularly, who had aspirations of going on to medical school. There was evidence, credible evidence, quite frankly, that he was giving them failing grades, thereby aborting their plans to go on to medical school.
That's terrible.
And they took them. Oh, absolutely. So they took a stand, and unfortunately it culminated in a riot, not precipitated by the students themselves, but by the intervention of the riot police. And suffice it to say that Rosie Douglas was branded the leader. And a number of these students, there were over 90 arrested, a number were prosecuted, many from Trinidad, many from Jamaica, at least 3 from Dominica, a few from Barbados. Rosie was regarded as one of the ringleaders. He was convicted on or about April of 1971 and sentenced to 2 years less a day in custody. He served on or about 18 months. He was released in the summer of 1973. He was eventually deported from Canada in 1976 after he was deemed a security risk. So that, in summary, represents the story of this extraordinary Dominican up to the point of 1976. I should indicate that Rosie went to study agriculture. He sent to Canada by his father in 61. After studying agriculture at what is now known as Guelph University, he gravitated towards political science. He did an undergraduate degree in political science at Sir George Williams University. Sir George, yes, it is now known as Concordia University. And then he moved to McGill to do a master's. And it is while he was a student at master's, postgraduate student, that the events at Sir George Williams University exploded. And Rosie had not only a wonderful, extraordinary charisma, but he was a natural leader. And he found himself at the forefront of that struggle. I should indicate that well before February 1969, he had been very much involved in Canadian politics. In fact, he became a protege of John Diefenbaker, former Canadian Prime Minister. He was at one point the head of the Conservative Party in Canada. But Rosie was overtaken, as so many of his generation, by the struggle for civil rights in the States, by the Black Power movement. And by 1968, his political philosophies and ideas and views had become transformed by that radicalism. When Martin Luther King, unfortunately, was killed in April of 1968, then Rosie had reached a point of no return. He organized a 2,000-strong march to Ottawa. When the British parliamentarian known for his racist views, Enoch Powell, visited Canada in 1968, Rosie led a delegation to the chateau where he was given a speech and made him know that Canadians were not appreciative, at least racialized Canadians were not appreciative of his visit to Canada, where he was bent on propagating his prejudicial views. Rosie was a co-founder of a really significant event in October of 1968. It was the Black Writers Conference. And at that conference, the intellectual luminaries of the Caribbean, of Africa, of Canada, the States, they convened in a conference to speak about the Black condition, to speak about liberation, to speak about self-worth, to speak about Black identity. Among their ranks were persons like Stockley Carmichael, the history professor, Guyanese history professor, who was a professor at the University of the West Indies, Walter Rodney. That was Rosie himself. There were a number of other luminaries, Alvin Poussin, the psychiatrist from the States. Leroy Jones, a great poet, was invited, but the U.S. immigration prevented him from coming to Canada for that conference. But it was a watershed in the Black history, not only in Montreal, but in Canada, where you had this convention of intellectuals from the African diaspora convening to speak about the Black condition, a conference designed to instill pride and dignity among students and Black people, in not only in Montreal, but in Canada. We're talking about the 1960s. We're talking about a period which was rife with racism. We're talking about a period when, as a community, racialized communities, particularly from the Caribbean, were on the defensive in terms of who they are. We're talking about a period when students who would go in search of residence apartments would be told it's already taken. We're talking about a period when Black students would be charged a higher rent than their white counterparts. So this is the context in which all these events unraveled. And Rosie Douglas was at the very forefront of that struggle. So by the time he went back to Dominica forcefully against his will in 1976, Rosie had achieved a great degree of notoriety in Canada. Even while imprisoned, he wrote a couple of significant works on prison reform. He basically took issue with the fact that disproportionately persons of African origin, African Canadians, were incarcerated. He was ostracized as the leader of this riot on February 11th, 1969, the computer center of the university was destroyed. $2 million worth of computer equipment. A number of persons involved in the riot were prosecuted, many West Indians, including Rosie. Many were convicted, many were deported, charged fines. 3 persons, Rosie Douglas, a Barbadian student called Ann Cools, and an African Canadian called Brenda Dash, were prosecuted. Ms. Dash received a fine, Ann Cools a 3-month sentence. Rosie received a sentence of 2 years less a day. He served on about 18 months in custody. After he completed serving his sentence, he moved to Toronto, and with a number of fraternal organizations, progressive people, they organized meetings, they helped a number of causes, not only in Africa, but in the States, in the West Indies. A number of politicians benefited from Rosie's help. People like Ralph Gonzalez, the present Prime Minister of St. Vincent, the late Judge Odlum, who was also a political leader in St. Lucia, the late Tim Hector of Antigua, and a number of others. They had an informal organization among themselves. I should indicate that the struggle for equality was not limited to Canada. Many of these leaders were of Caribbean origin, and they envisaged a day when the Caribbean itself would be more welcoming and would be more enabling to the aspirations of working people in the Caribbean. So they did a lot of work there. Rosie fought his deportation. He established connections with a number of fraternal organizations, political parties, organizations such as, for example, Oxfam, which is a Canadian organization which has done a lot of work in the region, and other fraternal organizations. Suffice it to say that the Canadian authorities had issued a security certificate against Rosie, deeming him a security risk, with the machinations of an undercover agent hired by the RCMP to spy on him and to try to subvert the movement for Black equality, an African-American called Warren Hart. In fact, there was a commission of inquiry into the RCMP's activities in the late 70s, and it emerged in that inquiry the RCMP had been involved in a lot of illegal activities, including the bugging of members of parliament, some of whom were very supportive of Rosie. But suffice it to say that Rosie was deported on about April of 1976. He spent a few weeks in Cuba, and then he eventually went to Dominica. In Dominica, he became one of the main proponents for the independence of Dominica. He basically marshaled those forces which agitated for political independence from Britain. And that struggle culminated in 1979 when Dominica attained national independence from Britain.
From England?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And Rosie joined with a number of progressive politicians in Dominica to form the Dominican Liberation Movement. The movement fractured just before the 1980 general elections. I should indicate that before 1980, there was a huge upheaval politically in Dominica. The then Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister, Patrick Rowland John, he became Prime Minister when Dominica attained independence. And suffice it to say that in 1979, on May 29th, 1979 to be specific, there was a significant protest by fraternal organizations, trade union movements, political parties opposed to the John government, protesting the impending enactment of legislation, which one was designed to curb press freedom and to limit people's ability to become members of the union. Suffice it to say that members of the Dominica Defense Force opened live fire, on a crowd of protesters, killing at least one and wounding more than a dozen. And that precipitated a mass reaction to that type of activity by the Dominica Defense Force. Ultimately, many of John's ministers resigned under duress because many of them were stoned, their families, their houses. And there was an interim government which was put into place on about July of 1979. Rosie Douglas came up with a name for this interim government called the Committee for National Salvation, formed with the coming together of representatives from a number of groups in Dominica, church groups, political groups, social groups, and suffice it to say that interim government that was led by one of John's prior colleagues called Oliver Serafin. He was an interim prime minister. And that remained in effect. You may or may not remember, because I know you spent some time in Dominica, that in August 29, 1979 to be precise, Hurricane David struck Dominica and devastated virtually the whole of Dominica, destroyed the agricultural sector, infrastructure destroyed almost 70%. Thousands of Dominicans migrated, but suffice it to say that there was a number of events, political events, and which culminated in a general elections in 1980, and that election was won by Dame Mary Eugenia Charles. Rosie Douglas contested one of the seats. He lost. He subsequently, although remaining in Dominica, but he gravitated to becoming chairperson of an organization formed in Libya by Libyan Muammar Gaddafi called the Mathaba. And it was basically an organization designed to assist liberation struggles in African countries, Latin American countries, even in Ireland. And Rosie was almost like an ambassador, traveling all over the world, establishing connections with liberation movements in Africa, with the ANC, liberation movements in Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and assisting through the wealth of Libya, through its oil industry, assisting in the liberation struggles in those countries. He also provided significant financial assistance to persons in the Caribbean. He basically assisted many of them to go to Cuba, to study, to participate, to meet and discuss with activists in Latin America, in Africa. He organized for a number of Dominicans to travel to Libya for the very same purpose. At the same time, and starting in the 70s, Rosie forged links with Cuba. In fact, after Hurricane David, Rosie and another progressive intellectual called Bernard Wilshire was able to obtain significant financial assistance, also scholarship assistance, from the non-aligned movement. And from 1979, Rosie was able to arrange for hundreds of Dominican students to study in Cuba, to become doctors, to become vets, engineers, you name it. He was very much instrumental in that movement. And he continued, yes?
You said he died. Did you say he died suddenly?
Oh, absolutely. As I said, his ultimate triumph was to become Prime Minister of Dominica during the elections on January 31st, 2000. And after he became Prime Minister, he embarked on a very ambitious program of seeking assistance from every corner of the world, from leaders all over, from Europe, Africa, African Americans. In fact, when he was sworn in, he invited the son of Martin Luther King Jr. to Dominica. He envisaged having African Americans regard Dominica as their destination of choice. He contemplated making them honorary citizens of Dominica. He contemplated establishing relationships with universities all over, from Canada, from the States, from England. He envisaged, for example, empowering Dominica, making Dominica an IT capital. He forged links with various universities, University of Louisiana, York University in Toronto, to establish a training facility in Dominica where students from all over, university students, would come and meet at a learning establishment dedicated to botany and related fields. So he had this broad, all-encompassing vision of Dominica. And when he became prime minister, he basically spent significant periods of time all over traveling, trying to get as much assistance for Dominica. Now that traveling created a little backlash because before he died, members of the opposition, the press, members of his own cabinet were united in their belief that Rosie was traveling too much. He was not spending enough time in Dominica. And that traveling, that degree of traveling was detrimental to their political security.
So when you say, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt your flow, but when you say he died suddenly, what was the cause of death?
That's a great question. Controversy still swirls around the real cause of death. There are certain persons who believe that Rosie may have been assassinated. And again, it's possible because based on his work with the Mathaba in Libya, he no doubt would have created a number of political enemies. But he also had a number of political friends in Europe, in England, the socialist organizations in Europe, the Labour Party in England. Rosie had staunch allies in those political organizations. The fact of the matter is, in my view, the credible evidence, however, suggests that there was a medical reason compounded by a tsunami of political stress that resulted in his untimely death. You see, Rosie suffered from high blood pressure. And by all accounts, he did not take the medical treatment that one must take when one is afflicted by high blood pressure. No medication. Rosie was asked or advised by a number of friends who were medical practitioners he should take medication, take treatment for that problem. Black people, as you may know, have a propensity to suffer from high blood pressure. And I think high blood pressure is controlled by medication and I think a diet. Rosie believed that by jogging, getting involved in sports such as basketball, football, jogging, that he would keep the deleterious effects of high blood pressure at bay. As I said, he came back to Dominica on or about September 30th, 2000. And after he came back, a number of his people came to him, visited him at his modest home in Portsmouth, near to the Rosa Market, because he was a very humble man. And reports indicate that many advised him that in his absence, many of his cabinet colleagues were meeting and were expressing displeasure of his traveling. One notoriously said that we should chain him to a chair. So coming back to Dominica on the 30th of September and being assailed by information that this was what was happening, I should indicate parenthetically that when he came back, he tried to call many of his lieutenants. He never got a response. He called his second in command. He never got a response. The second in command later said that he was in the shower, taking a shower before he went to church, and that's why he didn't respond in time. He called about 3 or 4 of his colleagues. No one answered. My theory is that having this underlying medical condition and being assailed by news that his colleagues were expressing significant displeasure about his traveling and were even contemplating about replacing him I personally think, without being a doctor, at least not a medical one anyway, that had a very deleterious effect on his pressure.
Mhm.
Because as we all know, stress is something that aggravates high blood pressure.
Mhm.
And I think that is what happened in the early morning hours of the 1st of October 2000, when his house person found him dead. She initially thought that he was playing a prank on her because he was that type of person. But when she shook him and looked for a pulse, there was none. And obviously that precipitated a hurricane of emotions.
But
Not only, yes?
weren't his colleagues aware of why he was traveling? Wasn't he traveling to get help for Dominica and to establish connections to improve the country?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But politics is a blood sport, you see. And people were impatient. You see, Rosie had campaigned on a platform where he had highlighted his connection, his political connections with the world, with progressive organizations in Europe, in England, his links to Libya, his ability to get aid from a number of fraternal governments and organizations. So upon attaining the rank of Prime Minister, he felt he had an obligation to obtain help as soon as possible. So hence the traveling. But persons became impatient. And in the newspaper reports, all of which is chronicled in my book, in speeches by the opposition, in comments by some of his colleagues, there was a growing dissatisfaction over his traveling. And I've theorized that it is that news of some of his persons meeting in his absence to discuss this issue. My view is that heightened his high blood pressure, the level, and that may have been the precipitating cause of his demise.
So sad.
That's how I look at it.
That's so very sad. Now,
Very.
Irvin, as a offspring of Dominica, how, from your personal observation, how has the country, what impact losing him is visible to you on the country?
Oh, it's a very good question. Rosie was a visionary, someone who thought big, very conscientious. He had absolutely no interest in wealth. I can indicate to you that Rosie was a member of one of the wealthiest families in Dominica. In fact, in the heyday of his radicalism in the late 60s, early 70s, one of the policies he advocated was to dismantle all the large estates. His father owned a 600-acre estate in Dominica. Dismantle it and provide land to the working population. So among many sectors of Dominica, he was not very popular, but he was very honest. He had no interest in the accumulation of wealth. His main focus was to bring Dominica into the 21st century. He was very impatient because he had promised much and he had very little time to deliver. It is fair to say, in my view anyway, that Dominica has been the biggest loser as a result of Rosie's death. Dominica has not benefited from his vision. Dominica has not, unfortunately, benefited from the boldness. Dominica has not benefited from his altruism, his integrity, his sincerity. One of the things he wanted to do, is it okay?
Yeah, we ran out of time, but we'll keep going because this is so fascinating.
One of the things he wanted to do is to stop the sales of Dominican passports. And unfortunately, that was resuscitated after his death, with the result that over the last few years, there's been many notorious cases where persons dubious character, frankly criminals, have been found in possession of Dominican passports, even diplomatic passports. So that certainly has been a casualty of Rosie's vision. But not only that, he was very much about empowering the Dominican people. And we have paid a heavy price because today, even in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, you have many foreign organizations, regional organizations, being able to earn significant incomes in Dominica at a time when the local public works department has been dismantled, at a time when workers, skilled workers, are having difficulty finding jobs, providing for their children. So Dominica lost a significant amount of capital, significant amount of development, in my respectful view, with the death of Rosie Douglas. Many of his policies have been shelved. And again, I guess every leader has the prerogative to set his own policy. So from that perspective, one perhaps can't blame the current leadership of Dominica. But again, what is being instituted now marks a significant departure from Rosie's own policy. And in my view, we've paid a heavy price for that departure.
How long was he able to serve after he was elected as the prime minister before he died?
9 months. He
Are
was
you-
elected, well, less
What
than
were
9
they-
months.
What were they expecting? Magic? They did it.
There we go.
Yes.
Yes, but again, small island politics can be quite challenging, let's put it this way. It's almost a Darwinian type of mentality. The strongest shall survive, or the weak will perish or be cast by the wayside.
I think
It's almost a Darwinian code, unfortunately.
I think what is really sad is that I've listened to you. It sounds like this was a humanitarian who spent the majority of his life fighting for the less privileged, fighting for people with colored skin. And as I listen to you, I look back on the history of so many of these people: Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, now this gentleman, Rosie. And all of these people fought so hard and suffered so much and were imprisoned and then killed in some cases. And we still today, in the 21st century, are still struggling with the color of people's skin. This is insanity, in my opinion, and a lot of ignorance, because I don't know if people who have such hatred for others because of the color of their skin, I'm not sure if they are aware that if you take a knife and cut the skin away, you see the same thing.
Well, they're very much aware. The fact of the matter is, this is a power dynamic. The fact of the matter is, in times of economic downturns, the persons who are victimized by prejudice are typically racialized persons. Why? Because they're the ones being accused of taking all the jobs of others. They are the ones accused oftentimes of contaminating the society. And you know that firsthand in America. That's what's happening to a significant degree. Persons from South America are being demonized because of their characters. I mean, your former president is on record by referring to Mexicans, for example, as racist, as criminals, as rapists, and all the derogatory names. Prejudice is something, unfortunately, which has been with us, which in all likelihood will continue to be with us. And to me, the only question is, what do racialized persons do in face of that unrelenting prejudice? And I think in America, you've had the rudiments of a movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, that has already created significant strides. The repercussions of that movement have been felt in Canada. We lag behind you to some degree, but I think there's a realization that it's only through concerted action that you can get a semblance of equality, not only in North America, but throughout the world. But it's something which has to be continuously fought for. It is not something that will be handed to you on a platter. It is something that has to be fought for.
Well, if you were living where I live, you would discover that the Asians also feel that they're being discriminated against, and they
Well,
are.
absolutely.
And they are being discriminated against, apparently, because it was announced in this country that they started COVID. And so ignorant people have been terrorizing some Asian people because they're Asian and because COVID supposedly started in China. I don't understand this world we're living in. I feel like instead of advancing, we are moving backwards. We've advanced in the technological sense, but when it comes to the way we treat each other, I am just dumbfounded because I can't come up with the appropriate adjective to describe the current situation and the way people are treating each other. And I think if we all learn and understand that we are all one, and that the color of our skin and the country that we come from and the language that we speak and whatever philosophical choices we make should not separate us. But unfortunately, they do. And you and I can sit here and talk about this until the cows come home. But hats off to the person who has a solution for this. And I don't know what it
Well,
is.
I don't think there's any panacea to deal with those issues. I think it's only through concerted action, only through a joining of hearts and minds of organizations that transcend race, color, creed, sexual orientation, pigmentation, colorism. I think it's only through a unanimity of effort, only through some type of rainbow coalition, only through a concerted action, which, as I said, spans or transcends all these quote unquote divisions, that we can move that agenda forward, where we are all accepted on the basis of, as Martin Luther King put it so eloquently, the content of your character rather than on the content of your skin, the color of your skin.
Well, Irvin, I have to say this has to be a to be continued segment, simply because you haven't received the book as yet, and
No.
because there's so much to be said on this topic and about your book that I know we can't cover it in one single segment. So why don't we do this? Anybody watching this, just be prepared that Dr. Andre is going to be returning to Conversations with Jennylyn, accompanied by his book that he is about to publish on Rosie. And then you can pick up a copy of it and you'll be able to see it before you purchase it. What do you think?
Wonderful.
Idea?
I think it's a great idea. And again, I must thank you. I expect to get it on Saturday. I hope everything goes well. And again, as I said, I feel honored to be invited back, and I will be happy to continue the conversation with you, and to hopefully answer any questions that you may have for me. What I can do also, if you send me the link, I'll send you my Hotmail so that I can send the link to other persons who may want to tune in, and hopefully who may even want to ask some questions.
Oh, that would be great.
Once you send me a date, I'll ask you to send it to my Hotmail so I can just forward it to a number of persons.
This would be wonderful. And you know what, Dr. Andre, what I think is important is that these conversations are great, but I think what would be even better are conversations where we can come up with some ways to put out there on how we could change these situations.
Well, we have to try, and every long journey starts with one step.
Exactly.
Or it starts with one conversation.
There you go. Exactly my sentiment.
Wonderful.
Thank you so very much.
So thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you again. And then we'll continue.
We will. And thank you so much for watching Conversations with Jennylyn. When a
Thank you, dear
conversation
listeners.
is all you need to be inspired. And I know I bring some tough topics. I would imagine this is one, but it's real and we need to fix it. It's no point in just talking about it. And I think every single person watching this segment, if you are someone who knows someone who hates a person because of their skin color or their religion, you can play a part by educating them or finding a way to talk them out of this ignorance, because that's what it is. And I will see you next time with another fascinating guest.
Thank you.
Broadcasting from Silicon Valley, California, this is Conversations with Jennylyn.
Watching Conversations with Jennylyn, formerly known as The Jennylyn Show. And as always, I bring you fascinating people with fascinating stories. At least I try to, and I have in the past, and today is no exception. My guest, Brandon Watkins, is a Stanford University Children's Hospital employee who has just done something phenomenal for the hospital. And I can't wait for him to tell you about it. Brandon?
Nice to meet you, Jennylyn. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this.